The Boeing 737 had been climbing through 38,000 feet when the first officer collapsed forward onto the yoke. His coffee cup hit the cockpit floor, still half full, the liquid spreading across non-slip rubber in a dark pool that caught the glow of instrument panels. Captain Morris grabbed his shoulder, shook once, then twice, then keyed the intercom with a voice that had gone tight and professional in that particular way that means everything is wrong. The passengers in first class heard it first, that barely perceptible change in engine tone, the slight bank left that corrected too quickly. A child in 12C asked his mother why the plane had hiccuped. She told him it was just turbulence and went back to her magazine, but her hand had found the armrest and wasn't letting go. In 22B, a woman in her late 30s slept with her cheek against the window, her breath fogging the plastic in rhythmic circles. She wore a faded university sweatshirt and had kicked off her shoes 2 hours ago. Her boarding pass, stuffed in the seat pocket, read Rays, Mora in smudged ink. The flight attendants were already moving toward the cockpit when Captain Morris made the announcement that would change everything. His voice came through the speakers with that same professional tightness, but now there was something else underneath it, something that made the man in 8F sit up straight because he'd spent 20 years in the Navy and recognized the sound of controlled fear. They needed someone who could fly, not a passenger who'd taken a Discovery flight once or knew how to work Microsoft Flight Simulator. They needed a pilot, a real one, immediately. The cabin went silent in that strange way that 300 people holding their breath creates a kind of vacuum. Somewhere in the back, a baby started crying. The man in 8F was already unbuckling, his hand raised. When Captain Hale stood up from 4A, he was broad-shouldered, late 40s, and moved with the kind of economy that suggested military training. His polo shirt had a small trident embroidered on the chest. He identified himself calmly, former Navy, transport experience, and was walking toward the cockpit before most passengers had processed what was happening. That's when the woman in 22B opened her eyes. She didn't sit up immediately. For a moment she just stared at the ceiling panel, listening to the SEAL captain's voice carrying back through the cabin, listening to the slight whine in the hydraulics that shouldn't be there, feeling the barely perceptible yaw that meant someone in that cockpit was fighting the trim. Then Mora Reyes reached down, pulled on her shoes, and stood up. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't shout. She just moved up the aisle with a purposeful stride that made the flight attendant at the galley step aside without quite knowing why. The SEAL captain was already at the cockpit door, speaking in low, urgent tones with the senior attendant when Mora reached them. She was 5'6" in shoes, with dark hair pulled back in a careless ponytail and the kind of face that disappeared in crowds. Captain Hale glanced at her with the brief dismissive look that people who command respect learn to deploy, then returned his attention to the attendant who was explaining that Captain Morris needed help now. Immediately, they were down to one pilot and the autopilot was showing intermittent failures. Mora waited exactly 3 seconds. Then she spoke, and her voice had the same quality Morris's had carried, that professional tightness that comes from talking to air traffic control when things are going wrong at 500 knots. She said, "I can take left seat." Captain Hale turned fully now, reassessing. The attendant looked between them, uncertain. Mora didn't elaborate. She didn't explain her credentials or launch into her resume. She just stood there with her arms loose at her sides and waited, and there was something in her stillness that made Hale pause. He was accustomed to making rapid assessments of people, had done it in conditions far worse than this, and what he saw was a woman who wasn't performing confidence or trying to prove anything. She'd simply stated a fact and was waiting for reality to catch up. The attendant made the decision, nodding once, unlocking the cockpit door. Mora stepped through first. The cockpit was awash in amber warning lights. The first officer was slumped in his seat, breathing but unconscious, and Captain Morris had one hand on the yoke and the other dancing across overhead panels, silencing alarms that kept triggering in cascading sequence. He looked over as she entered, his face showing the war between hope and skepticism that comes when help arrives in an unexpected package. Captain Hale filled the doorway behind her, already reaching for the first officer to pull him clear. Mora's eyes were moving across the instrument panel in systematic sweeps, left to right, primary flight display to navigation display to engine instruments. She was reading the airplane before she'd said a word to Morris. He caught it, that practice scan pattern, and something in his shoulders dropped half an inch. She looked at him directly then and said, "Who's flying?" Morris managed something between a laugh and a cough. "Right now, me and Jesus." Mora stepped to the left seat as Hale dragged the first officer clear. She didn't sit immediately. She stood behind the seat, hands resting on the headrest, still reading instruments, reading the altitude hold engaged on the autopilot, reading the asymmetric thrust indication that suggested an engine problem they hadn't announced yet, reading the fuel totalizer, and doing the math in her head about how long they had before options started narrowing. Then she sat down, adjusted the seat forward 6 inches and plugged in the intercom lead. Her hands found the yoke with the unconscious ease of muscle memory, and Morris saw her fingers settle in the exact position of someone who'd spent thousands of hours holding that piece of metal and plastic. He didn't ask if she was qualified. He could see it in the way she moved. Instead he asked, "What's your type rating?" Mora's eyes hadn't left the panel. 737 NG. Apache Longbow before that. Morris blinked. Hale, securing the first officer into an empty jump seat, went very still. The word Apache hung in the cockpit air like a flare. Not a transport pilot. Not someone who'd logged civilian hours on peaceful routes. A combat helicopter pilot, attack variant, the kind who'd flown missions where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in rotor widths and reaction times calculated in fractions of seconds. Morris found his voice. "You flew Apache." Mara was bringing up the flight management system, checking their routing. 87th Combat Aviation out of Fort Campbell, 2 deployments, transitioned to commercial 5 years ago. She said it the way someone might mention they'd worked retail before switching careers, no weight to it, no emphasis. But Hale understood what those words meant. The 101st Airborne's Aviation Unit, not some stateside training rotation. Real deployments, real missions, the kind where you came back different or didn't come back at all. He moved up behind the center console, wedging himself into the narrow space behind the seats. Morris was already feeling the shift in dynamic, the way the cockpit had gone from his emergency to their emergency, a problem being handled by people who spoke the same language. He started his brief, quick, and professional. "First officer collapsed 15 minutes ago. Possible cardiac event. I've been single pilot since then. Autopilot is holding altitude, but we've got intermittent warnings on hydraulic system B, and the number 2 engine is running hot. Not critical yet, but trending wrong." Mora nodded, her hand already moving to the engine instruments, confirming what he'd said with her own eyes. "Trust but verify, the first thing they taught you." She checked the hydraulic pressure gauges, saw the fluctuation Morris meant, saw that they were still in the green, but the needle was dancing more than it should. She pulled up the status page on one of the displays, scanned the caution messages. 4 of them, all related to hydraulic system integrity. Not catastrophic. Not yet. But airplanes didn't get better on their own, they only got worse, and the gap between not yet catastrophic and catastrophic could close faster than most people realized. She said, "Where are we pointed?" Morris gestured at the navigation display. "Denver International. We were en route to San Francisco, but I diverted when Mark went down. Denver's 40 minutes out, good weather, long runways, and full emergency services." Mora studied the routing, the magenta line stretching across the moving map displayed toward the airport icon. 40 minutes was an eternity when things were going right. When they were going wrong, it could feel like flying through molasses, every second stretched and heavy. She said, "You declared the emergency." Morris nodded. "Medical and mechanical, ATCs clearing us priority handling." Captain Hale leaned forward between the seats. "What do you need me to do?" It was the right question, asked without ego, and Mora appreciated it. Some men with his background would have tried to take over or at least assert themselves into the decision-making. Hale was offering himself as a resource and waiting for instructions. She said, "Monitor the first officer. If he wakes up or his condition changes, let us know immediately. Otherwise stay available. If things deteriorate, we might need you for something." Hale nodded and moved back, giving them space. The cockpit settled into a new rhythm. Morris and Mora worked together with the efficiency of people who'd been trained in the same schools, who understood that cockpit resource management wasn't about being polite, it was about survival. She took primary control of the aircraft, her hands and feet settling onto the controls with the kind of relaxed readiness that looks effortless but takes years to develop. Morris handled communications and systems management, coordinating with dispatch and ATC while keeping one eye on the engine parameters. The passengers had gone quiet. That strange silence had settled over the cabin, the kind that happens when everyone knows something is wrong but nobody knows exactly what or how wrong. The flight attendants moved through the rows with plastic smiles and calm voices, but their training showed in the way they secured the galley carts early and made sure everyone's seatbelts were fastened. In 8F, the Navy veteran sat with his hands folded in his lap, watching the cockpit door and listening to the engine tone, with the focused attention of someone who understood that the people up front were fighting a battle the rest of them couldn't see. In 22B, Mora's magazine still lay open on her seat, an article about Mediterranean travel destinations half-read and already irrelevant. The sky outside the windows had deepened to that particular shade of blue that exists only at altitude, so dark it's almost purple, and the sun was beginning its long descent toward the western horizon. Mora watched the attitude indicator, keeping the wings level with small, precise inputs, feeling the airplane through the controls in that mysterious way that pilots describe, but civilians never quite understand. An airplane talks if you know how to listen. It tells you through the pressure on the yoke, through the sound of air moving over the fuselage, through 100 small vibrations and responses that add up to a language without words. This airplane was talking now, and what it was saying made her frown slightly. The hydraulic issue wasn't improving. The pressure was still in the green range, but it had dropped another 10 psi in the last 5 minutes. Not dramatic, not crisis level, but trending wrong, and trends mattered. She glanced at Morris, saw that he'd noticed it too, his eyes flicking to the hydraulic gauge and then to her, a silent question. She gave a small shake of her head. Not yet. They'd monitor it. If it dropped below minimums, they'd deal with it, but right now their job was to fly the airplane and not borrow trouble from 10 minutes in the future. The radio crackled. Denver Center, calling their flight number with the measured tones of a controller who'd been briefed on their situation and was ready for whatever came next. Morris took the call, confirming their position and estimated arrival time, and the controller read back their clearance in the efficient shorthand that makes air traffic control sound like poetry to anyone who understands it. 28 minutes to Denver now. Mora did the math automatically, calculating fuel burn and comparing it to their reserves, making sure the numbers worked. They did, with room to spare. The engines were still producing power symmetrically despite the number 2 running hot, and she'd already decided that if it got worse, she'd reduce thrust on that side and compensate with the other. It would make for an uneven arrival and complicate the landing, but an uneven landing you walked away from was infinitely preferable to the alternative. She thought about the Apache for the first time since sitting down, thought about the missions where she'd brought a shot-up bird home with half the systems red-lined and her co-pilot bleeding in the seat next to her, thought about the night outside Kandahar when she'd flown on instruments through a dust storm so thick it turned the world into a brown void and landed by memory and feel because the visibility was measured in feet. This was different, but the same. Same principle, same simple, terrible equation. Keep the aircraft flying, keep making the right decisions, and get everyone on the ground alive. Everything else was noise. Morris was watching her again, more openly now, and she could feel his assessment continuing. He'd accepted her competence when she'd sat down and proven she could read the instruments and speak the language, but now he was seeing something else, something in the way she flew that went beyond mere proficiency. Precision without tension, focus without rigidity. The mark of someone who'd done this in conditions where mistakes had consequences measured in lives. He said, "What was your call sign?" It was a strange question for the moment, but Mora understood why he was asking. Call signs were like nicknames in civilian life, but deeper, more permanent. They were given, not chosen, and they stuck. They meant something. She said, "Widow." The word dropped into the cockpit quiet. Captain Hale heard it from his position behind them, and something crossed his face, recognition or understanding or maybe just respect. Morris absorbed it, nodded slowly. He didn't ask why, and she didn't explain. Call signs came from stories, from incidents or personality traits or moments that defined you to your unit, and you didn't interrogate someone about theirs unless you were invited to. But both men understood immediately that widow wasn't a call sign given lightly or as a joke. It meant something specific, something probably not pleasant. The hydraulic pressure dropped another 5 psi. Mora saw it first, her eyes catching the needle movement in her peripheral vision, and her hand was already reaching for the overhead panel when Morris called it out. Hydraulic B is getting squirrely. She nodded, studying the gauge, then brought up the hydraulic schematic on one of the displays. The system was color-coded, showing fluid pathways and pressure zones in blues and greens that represented normal operations. System B showed mostly green still, but there were hints of amber beginning to creep in, caution ranges that meant they were approaching the edge of acceptable parameters. She said, "If it drops below 1500 psi, we're going to start losing redundancy on the flight controls." Morris understood the implication. The 737 had multiple hydraulic systems specifically so you could lose one and still fly the airplane, but the margins got narrower. Losing System B meant losing some of the backup systems that made flying easy and safe. It didn't mean they'd crash, but it meant the airplane would get harder to control, less forgiving of mistakes, and the landing would become significantly more complicated. He said, "We could divert to somewhere closer. Colorado Springs is off the right wing, maybe 20 minutes. Mora considered it. 20 minutes versus 28. 8 minutes saved, but Colorado Springs had shorter runways and less sophisticated emergency services. Denver was better equipped, better prepared, and the extra 8 minutes wasn't insurmountable unless the hydraulics failed completely, which they showed no signs of doing. She said, "We stay with Denver. We've got the runway length and the emergency equipment. Unless something changes dramatically, we're better off there." Morris agreed immediately. She'd made the right call and made it decisively, which was exactly what he needed right now. A second pilot not just capable of helping but capable of thinking, of making command decisions that might contradict his own if she thought it was right. That was the heart of good crew coordination, not deference, partnership. The minutes ticked past, 25 to Denver, 22, 20. The sky outside had gone from deep blue to the softer colors of early evening, and below them the terrain had shifted from the flat expanses of Kansas into the rising foothills of Colorado. The Rockies were visible ahead, a serrated line of peaks still holding patches of snow even in late spring. Denver International sprawled in the distance, visible now as a cluster of lights against the darkening landscape, its tent-like roof distinctive even from 40 miles out. The airport was built for moments like this, massive and modern with runways long enough to handle any emergency. Mora started her mental preparation for the approach and landing, running through the procedures in her head, anticipating the challenges. Normal landings were choreographed routines, each step following the previous in a smooth progression that became automatic after enough repetitions. Emergency landings were improvisations built on that foundation, requiring you to adapt the routine to whatever the airplane was giving you. She'd need to account for the potential hydraulic loss, which might mean manual reversion on some flight controls. She'd need to consider the hot engine, which could mean asymmetric thrust and a tendency to yaw on final approach. She'd need to brief the landing with Morris so they both knew who was doing what and when. And she'd need to do all of it while continuing to fly the airplane smoothly and professionally, because the passengers in the back were counting on the people up front to act like everything was under control even when it wasn't. Captain Hale's voice came from behind them, calm and quiet. "First officer is stable, breathing is regular, pulse is strong, still unconscious." Mora acknowledged without turning around. One less thing to worry about, at least for now. The poor man was probably having the worst day of his career, but at least he wasn't actively dying, which meant the people in the cockpit could focus on flying instead of first aid. Morris was already coordinating with the flight attendants through the intercom, making sure they were preparing the cabin for an emergency landing. Passengers would need to know what was happening, not the technical details, but enough to understand that the landing might be rougher than normal, that emergency equipment would be standing by, that they should pay attention to the safety briefing and be ready to evacuate if necessary. The senior attendant's voice came back professional and composed, confirming she understood and would begin preparations. The cabin address system clicked on, and her voice filled the airplane, calm and reassuring, as she explained that they were making an early landing in Denver due to a medical situation with the crew. 15 minutes out, Mora began the descent, pulling the throttles back and letting the nose drop gently, trading altitude for forward progress. The airplane responded smoothly, the flight controls still feeling normal despite the hydraulic pressure dancing at the edge of acceptable. Denver approach came on the radio with their descent clearance and initial vectors, guiding them into the sequence of arriving aircraft. The controller's voice had that particular quality that meant he knew their situation and was giving them priority handling without making a big show of it, keeping the frequency professional and calm. Morris read back the clearance with the same professional calm, and Mora turned the airplane onto the assigned heading, feeling it bank smoothly under her hands. Below them, the city lights were beginning to appear, a constellation of orange and white spreading across the plains. Somewhere down there, fire trucks were rolling out of their bays, emergency crews were running through checklists, and medical teams were preparing for whatever came next. All because two pilots and a former SEAL captain were working together 35,000 feet above them to make sure the emergency stayed managed and everyone walked away. Mora thought about the passengers, all those people in the back who'd boarded in Dallas thinking about their connections or their meetings or their families, who'd settled into their seats with books and tablets and travel pillows, who'd fallen asleep or watched movies or worked on laptops, completely unaware that their entire day was about to pivot on the decisions being made up front. That was the weight of it, the thing civilian friends never quite understood when she tried to explain what flying was really about. It wasn't the technical challenge or the romance of flight. It was the responsibility. Every decision you made in that left seat had consequences that rippled outward through hundreds of lives, and you carried that weight every single time you pushed the throttles forward for takeoff. Some pilots felt it as pressure, let it make them tentative or second-guess themselves. Mora had learned to feel it as focus. The weight didn't slow her down. It sharpened her, made her better. The hydraulic pressure dropped below 1700 psi, still in the acceptable range, but getting close to the threshold where they'd need to start changing their procedures. She called it out to Morris, her voice level and factual, and he acknowledged while pulling out the quick reference handbook to review the hydraulic loss procedures. They both knew the procedures by memory, but in an emergency you didn't trust memory alone. You verified everything, double-checked every step, because the time you were too confident to look something up was the time you'd miss something critical. Captain Hale watched them work from his position behind the center console, and what he saw confirmed what he'd suspected from the moment Mora had spoken in that confident professional tone outside the cockpit. He'd worked with pilots before, had jumped out of aircraft and ridden in helicopters, and coordinated with air support on more missions than he could count. And he'd learned to recognize the difference between people who were technically qualified and people who were genuine artists at their craft. Technical qualification got you through the normal days. Artistry got you through days like this. Mora Reyes was an artist, and he found himself grateful that she'd been sleeping in 22B instead of any other seat on this airplane. 10 minutes to Denver. The approach controller handed them off to tower, and the tower controller's voice came through with the calm efficiency that suggested he'd cleared the airspace and was ready for them. Cleared to land runway 34 right. Winds 340 at 8. Emergency equipment is standing by. Morris read back the clearance, and Mora started configuring the airplane for landing, calling for flaps and watching the speed bleed off as the wing area increased. The airplane shuddered slightly as the flaps extended, a moment of increased drag that you felt through the controls, and then smoothed out again as it settled into the new configuration. The landing gear came down with the solid chunk of mechanical locks engaging, 3 green lights illuminating on the panel to confirm all 3 wheels were down and secured. Mora felt the drag increase again, felt the airplane wanting to slow more aggressively, and she added a touch of power to maintain their approach speed. The number 2 engine responded sluggishly, still running hot, and she compensated with the number 1 engine to keep the thrust balanced. Below them the airport was growing larger, the runways visible now as strips of light against the dark ground. 6 miles out, Mora was hand-flying the approach, her right hand on the yoke and her left on the throttles, making constant small adjustments to keep them on the glide path. The instruments showed them perfectly centered, the needles on the approach indicators forming a precise cross that meant they were exactly where they needed to be in space. Morris was calling out altitudes and speeds, backing her up with the discipline of crew coordination that turned 2 pilots into a single unit. 500 above minimums, airspeed 85 knots, sync rate 700 feet per minute. Mora's eyes moved in a continuous scan between the instruments and the view outside, cross-checking what the gauges told her against what the world looked like, making sure they matched. The runway was straight ahead now, a broad strip of concrete that looked impossibly narrow from this distance but would grow rapidly as they descended. She could see the approach lights, the sequence of white strobes that marked the path to the runway threshold, and she used them as a visual reference to confirm her glide path. 4 miles. 3. The hydraulic pressure hit 1500 psi and the caution light illuminated. Morris called it out and Mora acknowledged, feeling a slight change in the control response as the system began losing pressure. The yoke felt different now, requiring more force to move, the powered assistance degrading as the hydraulic pressure dropped. It wasn't critical yet, she still had control authority, but she'd need to work harder to keep the airplane on path. The landing was going to be more manual, more physical, requiring her to muscle the controls rather than guide them gently. 2 miles. Mora started her final configuration checks, scanning the panel one more time to confirm everything was set correctly. Flaps full, gear down, approach speed stabilized. The runway was growing rapidly now, the perspective shifting as they descended, the ground rising up to meet them. She could see the emergency vehicles, a cluster of red and white trucks positioned near the runway, their lights strobing in the gathering darkness. 1 mile. Mora's world had narrowed to the essential elements. The runway straight ahead, the instruments showing her height and speed, the feel of the controls in her hands. Everything else had faded away. No thoughts about the passengers, or the emergency, or the stakes involved. Just the pure immediate present of flying the airplane down to the ground. Morris called out the radio altimeter readings, the height above ground counting down in a steady voice that provided rhythm to the approach. 200 feet, 150, 100. The runway threshold passed beneath them, and Mora started the flare, pulling back gently on the yoke to arrest their descent and transition from flying to landing. The degraded hydraulics meant she had to pull harder than normal, using muscle to make the airplane respond, and for a moment she felt it resist, felt the controls fighting her. Then the nose came up, the descent slowed, and the main wheels kissed the concrete with a chirp of rubber that announced they were down. She held the nose up, keeping the weight on the main gear, using aerodynamic braking to slow them before lowering the nose wheel. The reversers deployed with a roar of redirected thrust, and the airplane shuddered as the deceleration hit, pressing everyone forward against their seatbelts. Mora kept the wings level with the yoke while using her feet on the rudder pedals to keep them tracking straight down the center line. The number 2 engine's reverser was giving partial thrust, asymmetric again, trying to push them left, and she compensated with right rudder, feeling the pedal pressure against her foot. The airplane slowed through 80 knots, 70, 60. Mora brought the nose wheel down gently and transitioned to steering with the tiller, guiding them off the runway at the first taxiway. As soon as they were clear, she stopped the airplane and set the parking brake, and Morris was already running the after-landing checks, securing the engines and systems. The emergency vehicles surrounded them immediately, the firefighters deploying in practice coordination even though there was no fire, no visible damage, nothing dramatic happening. They were there because that's what emergency crews did, and their presence was somehow reassuring, a reminder that the whole system had worked exactly as designed. Mora sat back in her seat and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were steady on the controls, no shaking, no adrenaline reaction. That would come later, maybe, when her body realized it was allowed to stand down. For now there was still work to do, paperwork to file and reports to make, and all the administrative aftermath that followed every emergency. Morris was looking at her with an expression somewhere between gratitude and respect, and he reached over to shake her hand in the cramped space of the cockpit. "Hell of a job," he said simply, and there wasn't much else that needed saying. Captain Hale had moved up between the seats again, and he was smiling slightly, the kind of smile that suggested he'd known all along how this would end. "Impressive flying, Widow," he said, using her call sign deliberately, and Mora nodded her acknowledgement. The passengers were beginning to realize they were on the ground, safely stopped with emergency vehicles surrounding them. The cabin erupted in applause, that spontaneous expression of relief and gratitude that happens when people understand how close they came to something terrible. Mora could hear it through the cockpit door, a wave of sound that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. She wasn't good with recognition, never had been, preferred to do her job quietly and move on. But she understood what that applause meant. It wasn't really for her. It was for the simple, profound fact that they were alive and whole and would see their families again. The emergency evacuation wasn't needed. The medical crew came aboard to collect the first officer, who was beginning to regain consciousness and would be transported to the hospital for evaluation and treatment. The passengers deplaned normally through the jetway that pulled up after the emergency vehicles cleared, filing past the cockpit door in a steady stream. Many of them paused to look in, to see the people who'd brought them down safely, and some said thank you, and some just nodded, and some had tears in their eyes. Mora and Morris accepted their thanks with the professional modesty that pilots are trained to display, deflecting and minimizing, saying it was just doing their jobs. When the airplane was finally empty except for the crew, Mora gathered her few belongings from where she'd left them in 22B, her magazine and her phone and her small carry-on from the overhead bin. The seat looked different now, somehow, as if it belonged to a different flight or a different lifetime. She walked back up to the cockpit where Morris and Captain Hale were finishing up with the airline officials and airport authorities, giving their statements and signing forms. A company supervisor had arrived, a harried-looking man with a tablet and an air of controlled crisis management, and he was already talking about getting the passengers rebooked and arranging hotels and transportation. When he saw Mora, he stopped mid-sentence, his expression shifting to something like wonder. "You're the passenger pilot," he said, and Mora confirmed she was. The supervisor looked at her like she'd manifested from thin air. "We're going to need your information for the report, and frankly, the company is going to want to thank you properly. You just saved us a major incident." Mora provided her details mechanically, her pilot's license number and contact information, but she brushed aside the thanks with the same deflection she'd used with the passengers. She didn't want recognition or rewards or any kind of spotlight. She wanted to get to a hotel, take a hot shower, and sleep for 12 hours. The adrenaline was finally beginning to ebb and exhaustion was waiting to take its place. Captain Morris walked her out of the airplane and down the jetway, and when they reached the gate area he stopped and turned to face her properly. "I need to ask," he said. "Your call sign, Widow. I've been thinking about it since you told me, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion, but I want to hear it from you." Mora met his eyes, weighing whether to answer. Call signs were personal, often painful, and she didn't owe explanations to strangers. But Morris wasn't really a stranger anymore. They'd shared the bond that comes from facing an emergency together, from trusting each other with their lives and the lives of everyone on that airplane. That created a connection that mattered. She said, "My co-pilot, my permanent co-pilot in the Apache. We flew together for 18 months, 2 full deployments. His name was Sam Vega. We took fire during an extract mission outside Mosul. An RPG hit the tail rotor. I got us down, but he didn't make it." Morris absorbed this, nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." Morris shrugged slightly, a gesture that minimized nothing but acknowledged that words were inadequate. "It was a long time ago, but the unit gave me the call sign after that, because I walked away from a crash that should have killed us both, because I kept flying Apache after losing my co-pilot, and statistically most pilots don't. They said I was the Widowmaker, the one who survived. Eventually they shortened it to just Widow." She said it matter-of-factly, without emotion, but Morris understood the weight those words carried. Survivor's guilt, the burden of continuing when someone beside you didn't, the question that probably still woke her up some nights asking why she'd lived and he'd died. That wasn't something you got over. It was something you carried and learned to function with. Captain Hale had joined them in the jetway, and he'd overheard the last part of the explanation. He said, "Vega was lucky to fly with someone that good. A lesser pilot and you both would have died. The fact that he didn't make it doesn't diminish what you did to give him a chance." It was the kind of thing people said, well-meaning attempts to alleviate guilt that couldn't be alleviated. But coming from Hale, someone who'd certainly lost people under his command and understood exactly what that felt like, the words carried more weight than usual. Mora accepted them with a small nod, then shouldered her bag and prepared to leave. Morris stopped her one more time. "Will you keep flying commercial?" he asked. It was a strange question, but Mora understood why he was asking. Some pilots couldn't go back after a close call, found that their nerve was gone or their confidence shaken. He was checking if today had broken something in her. She smiled slightly, the first real smile she'd managed since waking up in 22B. "I've got an interview with Southwest next month. Today probably helped my resume." Morris laughed, the tension finally breaking completely, and shook her hand again. "If you want a reference, call me anytime. I mean that." They exchanged contact information, and then Mora walked away through the terminal, just another passenger moving through the evening crowds. No one looked at her twice. No one recognized her as the woman who'd landed the airplane that was already being discussed on aviation forums and news sites. She was anonymous again, which was exactly how she preferred it. The hotel room the airline provided was generic but clean, and Mora dropped her bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed without bothering to undress. Her phone had a dozen missed calls and twice as many text messages, news spreading through her contacts about what had happened. She'd deal with them tomorrow. Tonight she just wanted the silence and the stillness and the simple, profound relief of being alive and on the ground. She thought about Sam Vega for the first time in months, really thought about him rather than just carrying his memory as background weight. Wondered what he'd think of today, of her sitting down in that cockpit and flying strangers to safety. Probably would have made some wisecrack about her being too stubborn to let a little hydraulic failure stop her. Would have called her widow in that affectionate teasing way he'd developed before the call sign had taken on its tragic meaning. She missed him suddenly and fiercely, missed having a co-pilot who knew her so well that words were optional, who could read her intentions from the slightest movement and respond before she had to ask. Morris had been good today, professional and competent, but they'd been strangers flying together by accident. With Sam it had been partnership, the kind that took hundreds of hours and shared danger to develop. She'd never found that again, not in the commercial cockpits where co-pilots changed every few days and relationships stayed professional and distant. Maybe that was okay. Maybe some things weren't meant to be replicated. She fell asleep thinking about the sky, about the way it had looked from 35,000 feet, that deep, impossible blue stretching forever. The sky didn't care about emergencies or heroics or survival. It just existed, vast and indifferent and beautiful, and you either learned to move through it safely or you didn't. Mora had learned. had been taught by good instructors and hard experience and the particular education that comes from surviving what should have killed you.